people now are getting ready to watch the Super Bowl here coming up. What, next week is that, Brian, out in Santa Clara? It'll be, who the heck's playing now? I guess it's Denver, and I've lived and lost track. I mean, that's how much I really don't care about this one.
Denver and the Cincinnati
Denver and Carolina,
Reds,
right? No, it's Denver and Carolina. I know. I mean, and I think I heard someone saying last night that Carolina will hang in. I think Denver's going to hang in there. I think Carolina's going to clean their clock.
Carolina has a 4-point advantage, man.
Well, they should.
Cam Newton. Hey, did you notice, though, that a lot of the players for Carolina, former graduates of the Ohio State University?
I know.
Go Buckeyes.
Your home state. My home state, too, by the way. My home state, too. But I'm not a big Ohio State fan. But, yeah, the Ohio State University. Yes, anyway, getting back to that. But a lot of people are looking at the odds now and all that kind of thing, and bets are starting to be placed. So the question this morning, I was reading this article about the idea of is Super Bowl betting fun or is it addiction? For a lot of people, they're getting into office pools and things like that. But where does it cross over from being fun to being an addiction? With us this morning here on the Gary Sutton Show is Tom Gagliano, who is an addiction expert. He also is a life coach, and he joins us here on WSBA. Hey, Tom, great to have you back on the show. Good morning to you.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me back.
It's always a pleasure to have you here, man. Hey, listen, let's talk a little bit about this thing because, it's a lot of people don't know when the fun turns into an addiction, do they?
No, it's easy. If you have an addictive personality, if you're a compulsive person, like anything else that can become addictive, whether it's drinking or whatever, some people can have a drink or two and have a lot of fun. And other people destroy their lives by drinking too much. Well, gambling's no different. I mean, you have the Super Bowl, it's exciting, it's great, and the bookies or whoever promotes gambling, whatever you're doing with gambling, they just could make it insane. You can bet on a coin toss. You can bet on who scores the most points in the first quarter. Who scores first, you could bet on that. They throw so many different ways to bet the game at you. And, again, if you're a person that has boundaries, if you're a person that doesn't have addictive qualities, compulsive qualities, have a lot of fun with it. But if not, you can get yourself in real big trouble.
How do you know when you're starting to get to be compulsive? By the way, I was looking just before I asked that question. More people bet on the Super Bowl than any event in American sports, period. I was looking at SBNation.com, and that says the total amount of money, for example, on the line worldwide is counted not in millions but in billions. And in Las Vegas in 2014, the 2014 Super Bowl, they produced a record $119 million. And we're looking at websites like DraftKings and FanDuel and all that. So you have a lot more chances to put your money on the line. So when do you know when the fun has crossed over into another area? I'm reminded of the commercials that talk about when buzz driving becomes drunk driving. It's the same kind of thing here when fun becomes addiction to betting.
Yeah, well, like all addictions, it's when you cross that line. When you do something you never swore you would do. When you start to make a bigger bet than you ever thought you would make. I swore I would never bet more than $50 or $100 on the Super Bowl. Now you're crossing the line. I swore I would never borrow money to finance my gambling, and you borrow money. When you're starting to say and do things that you swore you would never do, and usually when somebody really becomes compulsively or addicted to anything, it usually goes into three dimensions. One is, now I'm having problems with my family because I'm gambling more than I should be, and all of a sudden now it's affecting my family. Or two, I'm having problems at work. Maybe I'm not showing up at work, or maybe I am on the computer too long in reference to gambling, and I'm in jeopardy of losing my job. Or three, there are people that are in jail because of their gambling. People that started to do things they shouldn't have done for their gambling. So when it crosses family lines, when it crosses work lines or legal lines, you really better know that you have a problem, and you better reach out and allow other people to help you take care of this addiction.
It's interesting, Tom. I'm always, when I see a guy that's a life coach or an addiction specialist, how did you ever get into this particular field?
Well, I'm I'm a compulsive gambler.
Okay.
So there you go. I wrote a book called The Problem Was Me, and we spoke about this the last time on the show. And my gambling, eventually, my wife and children left me. And I had to make a choice. I either was going to become a victim to my gambling, or I was going to have to get help, do something about that, or I was going to spend a very lonely life. And I started to go to programs, to therapy, and it's not easy. You know, nobody wants to admit that something beats them. But I can tell you that there are many compulsive gamblers that have committed suicide over their gambling eventually when they've lost everything. Yeah, our cemetery is filled with gamblers that thought that they can handle their addiction.
When did you hit that moment where you needed help? Obviously, your family leaving you, that's huge. But you know, was there a moment where you said, "Man, I got a really serious problem here"? What was that moment?
When it gets to that point where your life becomes unmanageable. Well, literally, I didn't want to open my eyes in the morning. I knew how much money I had lost that day or that week. And when the morning came, I didn't want to get out of bed. I did not want to face the world. Now, I'm also a very successful businessman, and back then I was making a fortune and gambling away too. I realized that I wasn't gambling really to win money. I was gambling to fill a void inside that money was not going to fill. And that, again, we go back to what I really talk about, and that's childhood messaging. I firmly believe that all of our intimacy, the roles we play, the lives we choose, are so connected to the messages we received in childhood. And if we receive messages that were really not good kids, that we weren't important to our mom or dad. My dad was an alcoholic who was out drinking all the time, and instead of at 10 years old saying, "Oh, gee, he has this addiction called alcoholism," at 10 years old, the child says, "Hey, what's the matter with me? What's the matter with me that Dad doesn't want to spend time with me?" And from there, from those negative core beliefs, came my addictions later. The addictions were symptoms. The negative core belief was the real issue and the real problem.
And, of course, you wrote a book called "Don't Put Your Crap in Your Kid's Diaper." It's a pretty graphic title, but, it kind of gets your attention in a hurry, doesn't it?
Well, you know what? Listen, parenting is one of the most difficult undertaking any of us can do. I know for me it was. And I wanted to write a book. I followed those who had what I wanted, a really good relationship with themselves and with their children. And I wanted to write a book to help parents recognize what areas of their parenting skills are strong and what areas needed a little improvement. We love our children so much sometimes that we want to protect them from the world. We sometimes we over-discipline them. Sometimes it's too permissive, but we don't realize sometimes the things that we're doing to our children. And I always say, Gary, you know what? I can't give my children what I don't have inside. If I'm not working on myself and building a better me, it's really tough for me to show up in a real healthy way for my kids.
Tom, I remember we talked before. Was there a comeback time with your family after they left you? Were they willing to give you another shot on this?
They did. My wife saw that I went to get help, and reluctantly, I was a typical addict who didn't trust any process he couldn't control. I didn't want to let people in, but it takes time to trust again, because early on in life, I found out real clearly people were not trustworthy. And as I grew older, I started to trust my addictions where I should have been trusting people. And eventually, slowly it came back. But for me, the biggest moment in my life happened when I was visiting, of all people, my father in a hospital who happened to be dying of cancer at the time. And I remember sitting there near him, and he was all hooked up, and he was frail, and he says, I was sitting where you were sitting 20 years ago when my father, that would be my grandfather, was dying of lung cancer. He says, I could never tell him I cared for him, and I could never tell him I loved him. And he said, Tommy, I don't want that to happen to you. And for me, that changed my life. I started to see that this wasn't a monster. This is a man like myself that grew up also with negative childhood messaging. This is a man very similar to me. And that's when I went away from that world of business, and I started to help other people, running groups free of charge in schools and in churches and in my house, trying to help people who suffered as I had from really negative childhood messaging, because I really believe that those messages early on will dictate every piece of our life.
So we're talking about gambling here. You're really looking back at childhood at being kind of the modeling stage, because we know that kids are like sponges at that point. I hate to use a poor metaphor, but I hear it all the time. And they're going to soak a lot of things up, and they're watching very, very carefully to see where's the model? What am I supposed to follow out there, right?
Well, you know what? If I have parents that I see how they cope with life. How do they cope with stress? How do they cope with victories in life? And if I see them coping with a bottle of scotch, or I see them coping by going to the racetrack and gambling, or by gambling on football at home, if that's their coping mechanism, that's going to be ingrained and become my coping mechanism. That's why many addicts have children that are addicts. And again, we have to look back on that childhood. How did my parents resolve conflict? Did they resolve it by helping each other, by being supportive to each other, or was there fighting? Was there one running out? Was there one controlling? All of these things get put in my diaper at a young age and will be acted out later on, because they're my models. As you said, that's what I see is the way to cope with life.
We're talking with Tom Gagliano this morning, who is a life coach, also an addiction expert, has been an addict himself, knows from where he speaks right now. So let's come back to gambling for a second here. So now you have, what would you tell parents? I mean, you mentioned about if you're a kid, you see your parents going off to the track pretty regularly, or going off to the casino pretty regularly, or talking about the bets at home pretty regularly. I mean, all of a sudden you start to say, well, what's that all about? And you start to get a little bit more interest as a kid, and now, putting some money down that maybe you don't have is, or maybe you're borrowing it from someplace where it should be spent, starts to happen a little bit, right?
Well, you don't grow up with boundaries. There is no boundaries. And what you do is you remember, children are egocentric. Gary, I love to say that when my son was 5 years old, he said, "Hey, Dad, what do you get me for Father's Day?" How's that? Is that egocentricity? Yeah, everything revolves around the child.
Right.
So when my dad's out gambling all the time, I don't say, "Oh, gee, he has a gambling addiction." I say, "What's the matter with me again? Am I not lovable? Am I defective? Why isn't he paying attention to me like he does to that gambling?" Because gambling, if it is an addiction, becomes the number one priority in the person's life, as alcohol is to an alcoholic. So again, it's the messaging that comes in, not so much what you see, but it's the messaging of the value you have as a child. And if you grow up with no value as a child, what you will eventually do is you'll act out those negative core beliefs, and you'll act them out in gambling, drinking, or in other ways. So it's really the messaging the child is taking in, being that they're egocentric. All children are, no matter whether you're in a wealthy family, a poor family, whatever your religion is. Children basically are the same in childhood, and they just absorb. And if mom and dad are not around, that just means something's wrong with me. That's an important piece here that later on will lead to the gambling or drinking or all of those other acting out behaviors.
Are there things that parents should look for in terms of behavior for their kids? We're talking about kids watching for parental behavior, but what about the parents, assuming that parents are, being good parents? What are the proactive things they can look for in their kids that might be, precursors to going out and having that kind of personality that might be addictive in some way?
Well, first of all, be curious with your kids. Know what sites they're on, know what they're doing, know what their interests are. But more important than that, Gary, is parents need to create a safe place for their kids, a safe environment where their children can talk to them, share their feelings, their struggles, their fears, their sexual orientation, their curiosity with drugs. If a parent creates a safe place for their children, and the child will talk to them about their struggles, they won't later solicit that information from the wrong people, and they won't develop negative core beliefs. I had a situation with my son where it was a family changer in my mind. Is when we had to put our dog to sleep, and I remember, my son grew up with this dog. He loved this dog, and I walked into my son's room, and I remember that day. He was very sad, and I put his arms around me, and he started to cry. And Gary, I realized that day what I was doing to change the messaging that I received is I was giving my son a safe place, a place to cry in his father's arms.
Yeah.
It wasn't a place I ever had as a kid, but because I was starting to set that up for him to know that he could make mistakes in life, it doesn't mean he is a mistake, that if he fails in life, it doesn't mean he's a failure. All of these messaging I give to my child early on will dictate and stop him from developing that addictive mentality later, because he's not going to want to fill a void inside, a pain inside.
What about when you go out and you gamble as a parent and you win? whether you go to the casino, whether you're on DraftKings or FanDuel, whether it's you're out and you win a big bet at the golf course, maybe whatever it might be. What do you suggest for parents who come home? I mean, I can remember winning a bet one time where I was going to be suckered into a bet at golf, and I ended up winning, I think, $250. And I came up and we bought dinner that night. Now I'm thinking back to that. I'm thinking, was I a poor model for my daughter and my wife in doing that, or is there something more to it? What are your thoughts on that, Tom?
Well, see, if you're gambling, honestly, to win a few dollars, to have fun, that's fine.
Yeah.
You're not going to give a poor example to your children. But a compulsive gambler is really not gambling to win. As crazy as it sounds, the worst thing that happened to me is in the beginning of gambling, I won. It was the worst thing that happened to me because it was creating a false sense of hope. It was distorted. It wasn't filling a void inside. It wasn't making me a better person, but I thought it would. The endorphins are going off, the chemicals telling me this is the greatest thing in the world. This is going to make me whole. And what happens is you keep chasing and chasing and chasing. In other words, a compulsive gambler will gamble until they lose. If I win $1 million, Gary, I'm going to gamble until I lose $2 million. If you win $250, you stopped. You had fun. Yeah. You enjoyed it. You went to dinner. But a compulsive gambler is not going to stop. They're going to keep going until they lose. And why? Because the money's not going to fill the void. The money is not going to make them whole. That's the distortion. Early on in life, a compulsive gambler wasn't trusting of people. They isolated. They lost hope in people. And all of us want to feel important, valued to those around us. So the gambler, the compulsive gambler, looks for that in the gambling, not in the people.
Wow.
It's very distorted.
I want to come back and talk to you more about that, and maybe some suggestions, Tom, things to stay away from when you're coming close to the edge of that cliff right there. And I want to tell you a quick story about a cruise ship I was on this year, and what I watched one night when I was in the casino was kind of interesting. Tom Gagliano with us. He's a life coach. He's a former addict himself. He's the author of several books, including his latest, Don't Put Your Crap in Your Kid's Diaper. And he's telling you why that is here on the Gary Sutton Show. We'll be right back with Tom and more right after this on News Radio 910 WSBA. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA, and we're back with Tom Gagliano, who's a life coach. He's an addiction specialist, and he's written a book called Don't Put Your Crap in Your Kid's Diaper. It kind of gets your attention, doesn't it? Tom's back with us. Hey, Tom, I got to tell you this story. I was on a cruise this year back in September. Went up to Halifax. In fact, stopped by New York. We went out of New York City right there at the Statue of Liberty, and went up and out at sea. They had the casino on board the ship. Now it was my first cruise I'd ever taken, so I took along like $100. I said, okay, I'm going to take $100 along in this thing, and if I lose it, I lose it. If I win, I'm going to put it back, and that'll be that. So I go out, and it was funny. I ended up, I think I won $40 or something on the whole cruise, or I think I might have lost $40 total on the whole cruise. So I spent like $60. But I'm watching people in these little casino things up there who are betting some serious money. And this one guy, I happened to be sitting next to this lady one night at this little penny slots I was playing or whatever. And just having fun, and just whiling the time away a little bit. And this guy comes over, and I'd seen, it's funny, when you're on a cruise ship, you see the same people all the time.
Right.
And amazing. I mean, you'd think, 4,000 people on the ship, you'd never see the same person. That's why you see these people all the time. And the guy and his wife had been out arguing on the deck the one night when my wife and I were sitting out on just on the deck watching the water, and the guy had been out there arguing with his wife. The guy was kind of a jerk. And so I'm sitting there, so his wife is sitting next to me at this penny slots thing. So he comes over and goes, hey, honey, I dropped 1,000. And she looks at him like she's incredulous. What? He goes, yeah, I just had a good run going, but dropped 1,000. And you were pretty sure that it wasn't 1,000 that they had to drop by her reaction, right?
Right.
And they go at each other again. So, I'm sitting there thinking, wow. And then the guy said, and the next words were, hey, can I have another 500? Asks her. And she gives it to him.
Right.
And I'm sitting there going, what is going on here? So now you get into the old enabling factor.
Yep.
And so tell me a little bit about what I saw there, Tom.
Well, what you saw is a man that crossed lines that is making his life and family unmanageable. And you see also his spouse, or his spouse, who doesn't want to do anything about it. So it's easier just to feed the addiction in her mind than to do something about it. You know, there's programs called 1-800-GAMBLER for somebody like him, and there's also Gagliano for somebody like her.
Yeah.
Because you really have to know, not only when you're living with an addict, that the addict is acting in destructive ways, but you also have to know how you are feeding that. You know, there's all ways to feed enablers. There's trying to hide what's going on in the family, not telling anyone else. There's the silent treatment, thinking that they're going to change because you're mad at them. There's a whole list of ways that co-addicts enable addicts, a whole list of them that people would be shocked if they read it, and they'd go, oh, my God, that's what I'm doing. You mean I'm actually feeding this? Yeah, you're feeding this. So there's a lot of help out there, but I could tell you, Gary, it's tough for anybody. It was tough for me to extend my hand to ask somebody to do for me what I couldn't do for myself, to nurse me to health. It's not an easy thing to do, and I could tell everybody out there that is married to an addict or is an addict, it's the toughest step in the world. But I can tell you that, you know, sometimes in life, you got to do what you don't feel like doing. It's as simple as that. You know, if you wait till you feel like doing it, you may never do it. So you got to take that huge step of courage. You got to call that number. You got to allow other people to do for you what you can't do for yourself, because addiction is progressive. It only gets worse. That guy that you saw in that boat, if he doesn't get help, he'll be saying 5,000 by next year. That's just the way addiction is. That's why, you know, there's people out there that buy tons of lottery tickets, and a compulsive gambler can't buy a lottery ticket. And if a compulsive gambler spoke to somebody in recovery that was a gambler and said, you know what, all I want to do today is buy one lottery ticket, just one, the response back from that person would be, you buy one lottery ticket, you may lose your house by the end of the night.
Yeah.
That's how serious this is, Gary.
You know, somewhere, we have about a minute left here, Tom, and I always enjoy talking with you because you tell it like it is.
Thanks.
Somewhere out there, there's someone listening right now and saying, this isn't me, and it is them. You know, maybe they're saying, I'm just having fun. Tom said it's okay to have fun. I'm just having fun. So a final word of caution for those people that are having fun right now during the Super Bowl, and you're not having fun. You're really into an addiction. What do you tell them?
I could tell them that there's people in jail that said the same thing at one time in their life. All I'm doing is having fun. I could tell you that there's people that have committed suicide that at one time in their life said, all I'm doing is having fun. I could tell you that is the reality of it, not the distortion. That's the reality of it. You know, again, we don't start out, you know, always drinking 2 bottles of scotch. Maybe it starts with a glass of beer. We don't always start out gambling at $500,000. Maybe my first bet, I'll never forget, it was $25. I went half with my brother, and it was exciting. $25, big deal. I can't tell you what my last bets were. They were incredible. And again, when I bet $25, do you think I thought for a minute that I'd be betting half of what my mortgage was on a football team?
Unbelievable.
No.
Tom,
No.
always great talking to you. The name of the book's Don't Put Your Crap in Your Kid's Diaper. Where can people pick that up, Tom?
Well, you can go to my website, which is the title of my first book, theproblemwasme.com, a title my wife loved. And,
all right.
And also, please, if you need help out there, 1-800-GAMBLER, extend your hand out to others. You someday will say it's the best thing you ever did.
Tom, great stuff, man. Thanks so much. I'll talk to you again very soon.
Great always being on your show, Gary.
Thanks, Tom. Tom Gagliano with us here on the Gary Sutton Show.